Jack.
Levi.
The Book Club from Hell.
Hello everyone, this is Jack with the Book Club from Hell, explorers of alternate dimensions, scales and selves, using the anomalous hardware of books. For this episode, I got to talk to Alexandru Constantin of the Black Ibis Social Club about Solenoid by Mircea Cărtărescu. Cărtărescu is a Romanian novelist, poet and essayist, among many other things, and Solenoid is his bizarro novel about escaping one's mundane existence through meditations on other dimensions, aniromancy, controlled hanging experiments, dental procedures, tuberculosis, solenoid-assisted levitation, protesting against death, and so much more. This book is truly mind-bending. If you like what we're doing with this podcast and want to support us, we have a Patreon account, the link to which is in the show notes. We release bonus episodes on Patreon, you can hear upcoming episodes early, and we have weekly voice chats with our subscribers. I've also published a novel called Tower, the first few chapters of which are available for free on my Substack, the link to which is also in the show notes. We also have a Discord server for this podcast on which you can find Levi, me, and plenty of other degenerates who listen to the Book Club from Hell. Link, again, in the show notes. Furthermore, if you're enjoying this podcast, please rate us on your podcast app of choice, like our videos on YouTube and so on. These sort of things really do help us with the algorithm, help us with visibility and discoverability. It really helps. Finally, everyone should check out the Black Ibis Social Club, Alex's podcast, which he hosts with Fisto Sabani. It's an extremely comfy podcast where they talk about books, movies, games, and anything else that floats into their hyper-caffeinated minds, very often with a guest or two. Links also in the show notes. So if you're ready to assemble a complex of your life's anomalies and use these to decode the liberating taps on your prison's walls, then listen on. Enjoy. I'm very pleased today to have Alex on, who's you're really the everything of Substack. You're a communist, you're a fascist, you're a shit lib, you're a crypto-Jewish Israeli Zionist operative who's also plotting the downfall of Israel. You've been accused of everything. You're also the host of the podcast formerly the Dicenius Review, now the Black Ibis Social Club. I learned of the name change maybe 5 minutes ago.
It happened 5 minutes ago. I decided on it as I was sitting here talking to you. No, I'm just joking.
Also, insect songs?
Yeah, it's kind of my fiction Substack. I started that, and I was going to share a lot more of my fiction, and that's has been my priority the last 6 months. But that's where I'm going to probably start putting out the novel I'm working on right now, if Neil allows me to. From
is that
Pylon Press.
the one with Pylon Press?
Yeah, that's the idea. But he's a taskmaster. You know, he's gonna throw it out 30 times.
I think you need that. It really helps. And then, is it Telios Music? Are you also doing that?
Yeah, so that's Alexander Helene's music review site. That's actually has a kind of a cool little origin. We both of us kind of agreed that we hate people that are like, there's no new music, it all sucks, yeah, blah blah blah, you know. And I disagree. I think there's a lot of fantastic new music, and I discover like a new band or a new musician almost like every month now, you know. I think it's like this era we live in right now has some of the best new music I've had since I was a teenager or, you know, even younger. And it's important for us middle-aged, I guess I'm not middle-aged yet, but like older guys to not become like those boomers that are like Van Halen for life and that kind of stuff. I guess Van Halen's not really a boomer thing. That's more, maybe. But so he set that up and we write reviews. I'm kind of bad at it because I actually have a harder time writing reviews than I do having fiction for some reason. I don't know why. It's like music reviews are tough because it's a different art form. It's like a different language to write.
Well, it's also how do you convey the very visceral experience of listening to something in words, like in a form of communication which is much more slow, methodical. It's a skill.
Right.
So I really like the podcast formerly known as the Dicenius Review. And so I reached out to you to see if you wanted to come on for an episode. And you suggested Solenoid by Mircea Cărtărescu, which was a complete mindfuck. This is like it's spoilers for the part of the episode where I say whether I recommend it or not. I think this book is truly remarkable, but also completely bizarre. Like this is not an easy book.
Right.
So what made you pick this book?
Okay, so first of all, I think that the novel Solenoid, which I believe came out in 2008, real recently. It came out recently, but it was
really recently. Let me check.
Yeah, I think it came out in the U.S. 2 years ago or something like that. I know I still see tons of copies of it, like the Barnes & Noble. Yeah.
2015, published in English 2022. Yeah, so very recent.
Right. So it's a Romanian novel, and it's honestly, I didn't recommend it because it's a Romanian novel, and I'm Romanian, right? I actually would have recommended it if it's any novel, right? And I picked it up because I was like, oh, look, a Romanian novel. Let me read this. And I was like, holy shit. But I honestly think, and I'll put this down on the record, I think Solenoid is probably one of the best, if not the best, novels that's come out in the 21st century so far. It's got
I'd back you on that. It is it's truly remarkable.
Well, it's up there, equal to or better than 2666, which also I believe came out in 2004. So it's early, but that novel itself kind of feels 20th century in a way.
More like the I always call them in my head kitchen sink novels. They're just everything in the kitchen sink, like your Pynchons, David Foster Wallace, Gaddis's. Bolaño definitely has that feeling. So does Solenoid, because it's this guy's whole life run through the wacky filter.
Right. So it really is it's a maximalist novel. I think the proper term for that is what you'd consider Bolaño, like this novel, everything by Pynchon, like Gravity's Rainbow and V, and I guess you could consider. I mean, should consider what's that one, Infinite Jest, which I've only read parts of. I'll admit I have never finished it. As another maximalist novel, and that's kind of where I like reading maximalist novels. I like reading novels that do a heavy lifting, where you have to stop and be like, what is he talking about? Let me go read this other book to understand this book, and that's, I like things that make you work for it in a way, in gamer speak. I'm I like the Dark Souls kind of games, it's like these novels are like the Dark Soul games of novels, where you have to actually kind of stop and find information somewhere else. You're reading 2666, which is also one of my favorite novels. And, to really understand it, you have to understand the political situations in Mexico with the Sinaloa cartels and the human trafficking going on in the California border, and, the missing people and all that stuff. And then you have to understand World War II history and that Eastern European, Ukrainian and Romanian history in 2666, which is always interesting because, Bolaño has this really weird Nazi obsession. If you've noticed in all his books, he's really fascinated. I mean, there's always a Nazi character that he's really into, and he's a communist, but he tends to portray them pretty positively as characters. But that's Solenoid. Solenoid, you gotta stop and you gotta okay, give me a second. I need to read about tesseracts for a little bit to really understand.
Yeah, he has that whole digression where he's like, "I'm gonna tell you about 4D cubes for 50 pages."
Right. Let me read about dream psychology and that kind of stuff, and then you go down this rabbit hole of just insanity, and now you're a better person for it. Yeah, and that's what makes these novels great. I think you're okay. I get it, But I'm glad you liked it. It's a novel where I put it at the top of my list, and people go, "Oh, should I read it?" I'm like, I don't know, maybe. I don't know. You probably. It's if you're recommending Tarkovsky films, right? If you tell somebody, "Oh yeah, you should watch Tarkovsky, he's great," and they're like, No.
Yeah,
or like David
it's
Lynch.
3 hours of sad Russians.
Right. It's like, I love him, but you just got to be the right person to do it. You got to have the right level of depression.
Yeah. I also really like these sorts of novels, the ones that construct an entire world. And so when you finish them, it feels like you've just stepped out of an alternate reality. Now you have to live in a different one.
Right.
And I can also see your reticence in recommending this to people, because I imagine most people just wouldn't like this at all. It's one of those books where large portions of it are not fun. Like they're fascinating, I think truly mind-expanding. The novel feels, in a very odd way, very high-dimensional.
Right. Well, I think that's his point, right?
Yeah. It's so, in terms of the structure of it, we get into it in more detail later, but for the first 250 or so pages, it felt like he was just throwing all of these really bizarre images and situations at me. And I thought, like, I enjoy this, but I'm wondering what the core is. And then suddenly it just hit me how many of these things connected. And then for the rest of the book is 650 pages or so. There was just the continuing realization that basically everything in the book refers to everything else. And it's this incredibly intricate puzzle box. And one which part of me wants to make interpretations of it, but another part of me reads certain sections of the book which seem to be arguing against interpreting anything and trying to look for symbolic meaning in anything and just experiencing it. It's a real whirlwind. But like quite a few of these really big novels, you have to work for it. It's like War and Peace gets great after 400 pages, but you need to make that payment.
You need to get
up
there,
front.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so interestingly enough, I don't know if I believe this or not, or if it's just like mythological bullshit. But if you like read Cărtărescu's bio, he says that like he wrote it in one take, one draft, and he never edited it or whatever. I'm sure what he means by that is he wrote it without going back, and then he never really like. I mean, I'm sure he had to edit it like for like that, clarity and that kind of stuff. But I think what he means is he never like changed things around or anything. And I could see that. I can see it read like that. Mm-hmm. I think when you look at the novel, the obvious inspiration and the obvious conversation it's having, it's going off of one Kafka, and the other big influence that is kind of everywhere in the novel is Borges. Completely. I think he even mentions Borges numerous times in the novel. And in a way, it's interesting to contrast this novel with some American fiction, like Pynchon or the other maximalists like David Foster Wallace, because Pynchon's absurdity tends to be funny. Right?
Yeah.
And the American sense of humor is very like irreverent and funny and kind of like cutesy. Like if you've read V, there's like the rat wedding, and then there's like the dude who files his teeth all sharp and just kind of funny shit. There's a lot of funny stuff in Pynchon, talking dogs and stuff. And it's funny and absurd. While Cărtărescu is like funny, but in a depressive Eastern European way.
It's Kafka humor is the way I thought of it.
Right.
It's like
and we're all dying.
The comedy is because the situation is so absurd, which is a feature of Pynchon. I feel like with those American absurd comic writers or writers with comic elements, there's actually a lot of slapstick. There's a lot of slapstick humor in Pynchon, which I really enjoy, which is not present here. The humor is because the entire situation is so bizarre. Like walking into an abandoned pipe factory with a maths teacher and coming across a giant toddler who chases you up a water tower, and like that's the joke.
Right. Oh, our city's there's a giant skull buried underneath the neighborhood, and it's got a magic machine living in it. Yeah, but it's normal. Nobody like bats an eye. Oh, and aliens pick us up. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and all of the suffering of Bucharest is funneled through the aorta of pain beneath the city to feed the subterranean creatures who visit you at night.
And the way the characters kind of react to it's very like, communist era. Like, well, everything sucks. Yeah, I mean, it's normal, man. Okay, cool.
Of course,
I'm going to go back to suffering in the corner. Okay, like it's very. I don't know if you were familiar and how old you are, but there used to be like this corny but popular kind of cheesy like Flash animation thing back in the day on the internet called Salad Fingers.
Oh yeah, that was when I was in high school.
Yeah, do you remember the vibe? It had this vibe, that weird. That's kind of what the book feels like to me in a way, like that whole like, what the fuck is going on here? Like this is miserable. It's miserable and funny, but miserable at the same time, and like that's kind of the feel. It's like very Salad Fingers in a way.
Yeah. It's a sort of book where it feels truly surrealist in that there's no real plot or no conventional plot in like a succession of events that is in some way engaging or gripping or illustrative of something. Instead, the trajectory of the novel seems to be a succession of repeated images or themes. For example, there are these 5 colours that keep appearing: dirty pink, dark blue, scarlet, ochre, and bright yellow. There are things like the main character keeps his baby teeth on him and will just pull them out and look at them. And that's this recurring theme. There's the recurring theme of the dentist and visiting the dentist and being in intense pain. A recurring theme of loneliness. The recurring solenoids, which for listeners... I know actually we have a surprising number of engineers who listen to us, so you just ignore my bad explanation of this. But for everyone else,
I don't even know what it is, to be honest.
It's a solenoid. It's a helical. It's a coil of wire that you run a current through, and in doing so, it generates a magnetic field. So it's a type of electromagnet.
That's what I imagined it as being.
Don't ask me how magnets work. Like beyond that, I have no clue.
Magic.
It's just magic. I think ICP nailed it.
Mm-hmm.
And like the solenoids are they're important in a plot sense. Again, not in the case of a succession of important events, but a succession of important symbols. Because these solenoids are buried around Bucharest, where most of the story takes place, in important areas or areas linked to important people with respect to the plot. For example, there's one, I think, within a giant skull, where one character in the book finds his daughter whom he conceived in a dream, and that's just where the solenoid is. And to give an impression of what the characters in this book are like you said before, these things just kind of pass without comment. Like, people will acknowledge that, yep, this guy conceived his daughter in a dream, then found her in a giant skull buried just in some neighborhood of Bucharest. But beyond that, no one expresses any surprise. It's just the sort of thing that happens here.
Right. But you have to keep in mind, though, right? That's a very communist era Eastern European thing, right? It's like, oh, this guy just disappeared. Aliens took him, right?
Yeah.
Like, you gotta live. You gotta keep going, right? And that's something that is part of like the Eastern European kind of mindset. And I mean, I'm not going to speak for all Eastern Europeans, but I'll speak for, at least my version. I've noticed that there's a fatalism, an absurdist fatalism to the culture, right? Where, Americans need everything explained. We got to explain this. I need lists and bullet points. Well, a lot of Eastern Europeans are like, it just fucking happens, like aliens or whatever, like magic. Right. And it's kind of a way of dealing with the world when you're, you don't have the agency to fully affect it. Right. I think before we keep going, I think we kind of should give it overall the book.
Yeah.
Right.
Let's give an overall plot, because approaching this is really hard, because everything refers to everything in this
Right.
book. It's crazy.
So, for listeners, the book Solenoid by Romanian author Mircea Cărtărescu is, I'd say about that thick. Not horrible, in length. It's not like Crime and Punishment or anything like that, but it's a good one. And what it is, it's a first person narrative. You're basically reading this guy's diaries, and he's a English teacher, a high school English teacher in Bucharest, specifically in like the outskirts of Bucharest, right? Like in the suburbs of Bucharest. One thing for American listeners that might have a hard time understanding European cities work backwards than American cities. Inside the city, expensive; outside the city, bad, right? Which is very different than the United States, where suburbs good, inside city bad, right? So when you say inner city in the United States, it's like, you're like, oh, that's the ghetto. That's where you get murdered, right? When you say inner city in Europe, not all cities, but Eastern Europe specifically, that's where you want to live. And it's like the outside where you don't want to live, right? So this guy lives out on the outskirts in the 80s during communism, and he just kind of vomits his life. I think the key point that kind of triggers the novel is that he always wanted to be a poet, right? He was going to be a poet. He was a poet. He wrote this, supposed masterpiece called The Fall. It's just this epic, massive epic, like mystical poem, right? And he got invited to this club, this literary club called the Club of the Moon or something like that, I think, if I remember right, because I know there's some symbolism to it. And he goes up there, and the professor, the club sponsor, it's like his like idol, basically. He goes on there and he reads this fucking poem, and it's garbage, right? Like, nobody likes it, right? No, everybody's like, oh, it's trash, and he quits. He never writes again. He basically goes off and becomes a mediocre English teacher in like the boonies, basically, in the
School
outskirts
86.
of town. Right. And exactly, he's not like at the beginning, like school 1 or 2 or whatever, because they're all named. They used to be numbered by names, right? He's out in the middle of nowhere, and a lot of his his students are basically living in poverty on the edges of the urban communism, and there's a lot of like gypsies, which gets brought up a lot, and that might require some reading about that situation if you're not European, and kind of marginalized people living out in the edge, and he's miserable, and he lives in his house that's shaped like a boat.
Oh yeah, the boat house is. Yeah. It's coming back though to you talking about his poem being one of the big precipitating events in this novel. It's one of the things that makes this novel so interesting, and one of the things that makes it so hard to categorize is that in some ways it feels like an autobiography of a different life that Mircea Cărtărescu might have lived, because I think in this book at one stage the protagonist is never named, but he says his initials are MC.
Right.
The same as the author. And I think also Mircea Cărtărescu in our timeline, when he was young, and I think at the same age that the main character in Solenoid read his poem at this Salon of the Moon, or whatever it was called exactly, Cărtărescu also read out an epic poem, but it was really well received. And so this book feels almost like a different Mircea Cărtărescu writing a diary reflecting on an alternate life that might have happened, which is actually the author's real life. It's so strange.
Right. So that's absolutely true, right? So if you read his bio, he in his early 20s or whatever, he went and read this poem, and I believe it was called The Levant, which you can actually buy. I think it's in translation. And no, actually, don't read it because it's impossible to translate, and I'll explain why in a second, right? But he read this epic poem, and you know, it skyrocketed him to like, you know, minor literary fame in Romania. And then eventually with his novels, he gained wider European fame. And, you know, I think he got nominated for a Nobel Prize in writing.
Yeah, I read there are whispers of him being nominated.
The reason why I don't recommend the Levant is because it's a epic long poem that I can't even read it myself because I don't read Romanian as well as required. But in it, he goes through like eras, like kind of mythological eras of like Romanian history. But he uses the language and like modes and styles of like Romanian poets from the beginning to now. And there's no way you can translate that. You know, it's like it just wouldn't make any sense because it's all about the language play. It's not worth reading.
It's just to operate at that level of linguistic mastery, where you're not only writing in your own voice, but you're in a chameleonic way just taking on the voices of other poets and throwing them together is wild.
Right. It's pretty cool. I wish I had that, you know. And that's, I think what's great is that like there's a lot of Proust inside this novel too. There's a lot of elements of Proust where instead of Madeline's, he's obsessing about something crappy.
He's obsessing with like pulling lint out of his belly button or lice
or like his teeth in a jar and stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean that's the novel. The novel it's basically this teacher, and he is living by himself in this house that's shaped like a boat, kind of like in the ghetto basically, and he has a bunch of encounters, and it jumps back and forth in time of him teaching. He travels around a bit, and it gets kind of weirder and weirder, and you're in a Dali painting in a way when you're reading this novel. But there's a lot of interesting themes in it, which it starts off with the idea of like this multiple life thing, right? Like, you're right. So like you can look at it as like in life you have certain key elements, right? Like certain key points, you know, where if it doesn't go this way, your life can be a completely different thing, you know, like, you know, massively speaking, right? And you can look at that in a kind of we always go back to our favorite guest, Brad Kelly, right? Because we talked about metaphysical stuff on our episode with him, and I think you did too with him a lot, you know? There's an element of...
It's easy to do with him.
Right. There's a moment where maybe the divine or like another dimension breaks into our world, right? And that's where things crack, right? And like go different ways. And I think that in a way, that's what happened when the poem failed, right? Because it can go either way, right? It can go like, okay, it gets accepted and I get a scholarship and I go off to college and I become a famous writer. Or everybody laughs at me and it's crap and failure and I go become a mediocre, you know, professor or something like that, you know, or something like that. And I think that's what he took. And a lot of times, like we look at those kinds and, you know, there are hierophanies, you know, where I think the divine kind of inspiration comes in and something happens, right? Like the universe fireworks for a second. But you can look at your own life, right? And I can think of certain points where like, if I made a left instead of a right, my entire life would be completely, you know, unrecognizable, right? Like, you know, I met my wife on a random whim because a friend drugged me out of my like laziness. And he's like, "Yeah, let's go out for dinner," you know? And I was like, I don't want to go. Right? And he's like, "No, man, you never come out anymore. All you want to do is sit around the house and read." I'm like, no, just a Donna. He's like, "You promised, bro. Let's go out." And I went on a Wednesday and I met my wife that night, you know, and she moved in like a week later. And then there we go. Like 15 years later, we're still together. Right. But if I didn't go out, it would never, my life would have been completely different. Right. I would have been dead or something. But, you know, so I think that's an interesting kind of concept to explore because not all choices have that level of like impact. I mean, you know, what I'm going to have for lunch this morning doesn't really matter in the same way as like, but sometimes like certain choices in your life are completely, you know, triggered alternate timelines or whatever, right? Yeah. Which is kind of a theme, right? In this is the idea of, you know, potential the idea of division, right? There's a part where in the novel where you find out he has a twin brother that disappeared.
Yeah.
Right. Is it real or is it like symbolic? Right? Is it like could that twin brother be the guy that did? Could it be the real Mircea Cărtărescu, for example? You know, and then he's hanging out with a robot.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, in the TB, like the children's TB facility in a classic Eastern European scene. And he's like a child with TB with all the other children with TB being taken care of by, it was Comrade Nistor or something.
Yeah.
Who turns out to be a robot.
And his best friend's like a cyborg, you know, you're like, yeah, that's completely fucking normal, you know, it's like, that makes sense. But for people that haven't read it, I highly recommend you read it. It's not like, he's not a robot. He just kind of is a robot. You know what I mean? It's not like, oh, I'm a robot. It's like, he's just, oh yeah, he's a fucking robot. Yeah, it makes sense. You know, like, it doesn't, but it does.
Yeah, and then it's this idea of things splitting, and then this idea of escape seems to animate a lot of the novel. Through so much of the novel, the main character is trying to seemingly escape his existence or his three-dimensional bodily existence by cataloguing, he calls them the anomalies in his life. These times when alternate timelines or alternate dimensions might have intersected with his own. And by examining these anomalies, he keeps returning to this metaphor of being in this prison, like a cell with infinite walls or a cell above the sea, and listening to taps on the wall, and through decoding these taps in the wall, finding out a way to escape. And this leads in all sorts of really odd directions. One such direction is through an extended discussion of the mathematicians Boole and Hinton, and then I think the communist and author Lilian Voynich, and then from Lilian Voynich to the Voynich manuscript, this line of real people whose lives in this book are mostly like they are in our timeline, but also he'll just make a bunch of stuff up and won't say which things are made up and which things are real. But through that trajectory, gets to talking about hypercubes for a really long period, and then brings in this idea of exit from his current right by finding an additional axis, in addition to three-dimensional space, and just moving out from there. It's a fascinating idea, making a work examining different potential lives that one could have lived. And I think he actually manages it. He manages something that strange by using what is ultimately quite a linear art form, the novel. Because when you think about it, well, what are you reading? You're reading in one dimension, effectively, like from left to right. And through that, these repeating motifs and symbols, he actually does manage to convey the experience of a man living, or at least experiencing, aspects of multiple lives, in addition to the knowledge of the author is drawing on his own life and throwing his own life into there as well, and intentionally offering some opposites to things that have happened in his own life.
Right. I think that the novel itself is and this is where, okay, honestly, this is where I say it's probably one of the best novels of the 21st century. And the reason I say that is because it goes above a linear story. I think the novel itself is like a tesseract, you know?
Yeah.
He's playing with the idea of forcing you to think about levels above and below where you're residing at, you know? Because when you look at a tesseract, you can't really picture it, you know? You can't see it. You can only see like its trail representation on the paper, right? Like, or on the 3D model on the screen, but still a 2D screen. So what you're really seeing is this four-dimensional thing that kind of leaves like a snail trail on our own perception in a way, right? And I think that's what he's trying to do with this novel, is he's trying to make one think about multiple multiple time zone, multiple times at the same time, right? Because like it's like, is this a biography? Is this not a biography of the author? Is it a fake one? How about the other characters he mentions? Because almost all the characters are real people. A lot of them are real people in the world, but some of the stuff about them is completely bullshit, right? So what's going on? The city itself, the city of Bucharest, is a character in it, right? And some of the best lines about the city are that he talks about how most cities in the world will go from like a village to a skyscrapers. They'll build up, but he says Bucharest was just built the way it is. It came crappy from the beginning, right? He said it's like the city was built with all the rust and all the gargoyles and all the moss and all the the crumbled buildings and the dirty facades and the graffiti and stuff. It just came new like that. Like it came out of the box like fucked up. Yeah. And it's really fascinating because that city does feel like that if you go visit, right? There's this weird like kind of aged vibe to it, but also like crappy, but also cool. It's like it's an interesting place, right? Which I think communism had a lot to do with it in the pre-communist era. But he's exploring these times and these ideas and these people that are like, in dreams and what are. So, there's an idea in like Jungian stuff about I don't know if he talks about mandalas a lot too, right? Where you have to like meditate on the mandala. There's a symbol in Jungian, but also in like Christian mythology, Christian mysticism, called the mandrola, right? And it's basically, it looks like a Venn diagram, right? In the middle of the Venn diagram is that little eyeball thing, right? You know what I'm talking about, right? That's called the mandrola, which actually stands for, it's Latin for like almond, because it looks like an almond, right? It's like a fucking thing, but it also looks like right? You know what I'm talking about? Not to be vulgar, right? There's a symbolism, right? It looks like a vagina, right? And if you look at pictures of icons of Christ as a whole, right? If you pull it up, he'll be surrounded by this shape, right? Not a halo, which is in the more portraiture kind of icons. Actually, I'll show you right now. Okay. You see that shape?
Yeah.
Right? It's an almond, right? In this icon, it's not complete, but it actually goes all the way here, right? I actually just noticed it for the first time looking to my right. But so the idea is that it's two circles combined, right? And I think what that tries to represent is, one, in the icons, it's the divine nature of the divine and the normal. It's the contradictions, right? Divine, human, evil, good. Complete different, like, but they can both be true in the person of Christ, right? But you can also look at them as contradictions and two things existing at the same time, right? And that's kind of what this novel tries to illustrate, or is that multiple things can be true at the same time that are mutually exclusive, right? And that's hard for a lot of people to grasp the idea, because it is a metaphysical kind of concept, right? And it's like, can this be true? Can these giants and these solenoids and can all these people exist? Or are we living in a materialistic world? But can we live by both rules? Right? How do you conceptualize that? Like, how do you think, like, if I'm a dot on a piece of paper, I could never imagine living in a 3D world, right? Like, I wouldn't even have the conceptual idea, right? But the 3D world does leak into my, 1D or 2D world, right? Through representation, through like, I don't know, people drawing a cube on the paper, right? Is it really a 3D object when you draw a cube? No, but it's representational of, right? So it's basically, it's a idea of what's going on, right? And I think when, like, for example, when Brad Kelly on your episode, like, said that artist's job is to dream for the world, right? I think that's what also like priests, religious figures, philosophers, and that kind of stuff do, is they're able to maybe just get the snail trail, I like that word, of that next level, the next space. And their talent is really the ability to draw the cube, right? That's kind of my idea, Like, I think that's what the goal of art and artists and, creators is to hopefully see that next level and then be able to channel some representation in the form of a lower level for all of us, right? And you're right. I think the solenoids represent the places that attract stuff, and we've all seen that in the real world. There's places that attract like mystical or emotional areas, like whether they're monuments or even an alley that's weird and everybody gets murdered in, right? Right? Like, in cheesy like Wiccan magic or whatever, you'd say it's like a ley line or a node or something like that, right? Which he talks about in the books, I think, too, right? Like
the solenoids are placed at particular energetic nodes around Bucharest.
Right. Like in the morgue.
Yeah. The one below the Statue of Damnation. And then there's that whole subplot with the Picketists, the anti-death protest group. It's the sheer amount of stuff in this book is pretty mind-blowing. But back to what you were saying earlier, it's very reminiscent of one of my favourite books, one that I've heard you talk about quite a lot on your podcast, The Forest Passage by Ernst Junger. The idea that there is this world of being which is experienced directly, but you can't almost dimensionally reduce into language or some sort of representation. And what someone who has experience can do is leave behind symbols that point towards it. And I feel in some ways Cărtărescu is alluding to something, or might be alluding to something similar here, when he keeps saying your job is not to try to work out or think through or explain these anomalies. It's to experience them.
Right.
Or to just answer them.
Right.
It's
well, so the way, okay, so a lot of times in the, turns out we're like about the same age based on the last conversation, but in the era of like internet atheism, right, in the debunking era, right, where you had all those guys, the Snopes, was the Snopes or whatever, that said, is this real or not or whatever, right? People would always ask the question, well, is that real? Can it happen? Right? And let's do the there was that famous show with those two guys that would put all those stupid things to like test or whatever. Mythbusters, right?
The one where the host actually hated each other in the show.
Yeah, they hate each other, because, and the only reason anybody watched that show is for that chick on it, the redheaded one or whatever.
Yeah.
Right. They're like, these ugly dudes, and let's put this hot girl on here, But that question is dumb, right? Because the best way to answer that question, well, how about this? Well, how do you explain this in your religion or whatever? You're like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. People ask me, like, a lot of times they'll ask me, like, oh, you're a Christian, so you believe that the earth is 5,000 years old? I'm like, oh, I don't know. I don't know. How does that work? Well, how about like the fact that we got, I'm like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's true and it's also fake. It's how it works, right? In one way it's real, and the other way it's not, but they're both real. You know what I mean? And they're on different realms of existence or thought to me. That's how I look at it, right? This is not theology, by the way, so please don't cancel me for being a theologist. The idea is that, like, we don't need to explain everything. We don't have to get into these you're right, we don't have to get into this deep, like, scholastic idea of finding, like, how many angels can fit on the head of a pin, right? It doesn't matter. 1 billion or 1, it doesn't matter, right? It's like, but if you do see that happening, then you see it happening. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, it doesn't need to, not everything needs to be explained. And I think we live in a materialist world right now. And you see that seep into our art and culture, where every movie or new novel written or anything over explains everything. I don't know if you've seen this trend where it has to fucking explain everything.
I read very little contemporary literature. I tend to read things that are a few hundred years old, with the exception of novels by like internet friends I've come across. I get a lot out of doing that, but besides those, I tend not to read much new stuff.
Well, think about film, for example. Like the genre that suffers really bad for it right now is like horror on movies. It over explains everything. We have to know the history of the predator and the history of the alien and why they did that, and the history of Yuan-Ti, whatever the company in Alien is.
That's a good point, because like Michael Myers, at least I think, was at his absolute scariest when he was just a mask who killed people.
Right.
And it's like, why is he doing it? He just does. You can't reason with him. You can't talk him out of it. That's just what he does.
He's a force of nature. He's a solenoid, basically.
Yeah.
But you look at the movie Jaws, right? There's the beach town, and there's a fucking shark that eats people. That's it. That's all. Right? It never explains why there's this giant shark. I don't know. It just lives in the ocean, and it just wants to eat people because that's what sharks do. It's very like. It doesn't explain anything, and that's good. If Jaws was made in 2024, there'd be this plot line about like global warming making the water warm, and the shark, was a baby shark that grew too big because the warming waters, and it doesn't have enough food because all the fish died because it's your fault because you drove a car, and it'd be like fucking the main character would be some environmentalist or something like that. And that's exactly what they would do. They would over-explain the shit out of everything. And then the shark would need a psychologist to sit down and like go over its oppression. And it sucks, right? Like sometimes you just want the shark to be a shark to eat the shit out of people. You know what I mean, right? And that's how like life is. Sometimes you're just walking down the street and a car hits you and you're fucking dead. That's it, Or you find $100 on the ground and you're like, hey, cool. Then you buy cigarettes and then you die from cancer, But, it just, things don't need this casual explanation. By casual, I mean from this to this to this to this, Sometimes things just interact at this kind of level, And I think that's kind of one of the points of the novel where, I don't know, this guy hanging himself for fun, which by the way is one of my favorite parts of the book too.
Yeah, that was a really good part of the book where it's partly biography of, I think it's Nikolai Minovici, who was a real person who actually did study controlled hanging and like hanged himself for a bit. But in the book, it's just Cărtărescu starts just making stuff up, saying like, yeah, this guy would hang himself for hours at a time and have these crazy visions when he was hanging himself.
Right. So for the people that haven't read the book, there's a part where I think he's a pathologist of some sort in real life, turn of the century. And he, one of the things he did was he studied death by hanging. So he would actually hang himself. He would do these experiments where he'd hang himself. I think he lasted like 4 seconds before he
it was not as long as it is in the book, where he achieves some form of spiritual enlightenment by hanging himself for a really long time.
Yeah, in the novel, he basically like spiritually travels through hanging himself. And then there's the dream guys, also real.
Yeah. It's it was another Nikolai Vastchid, or I don't know how his name's pronounced, but.
And they're connected to the Voynich, like it's like the grand. Oh, you know what? He is the grandfather of the really hot girl teacher.
Oh, Florabella.
Florabella, yeah.
Yeah.
So, which is an interesting character too. Like, what does she represent? Right? You're like, I don't know, because there's so much layers to it.
It's getting back to what you were saying earlier. It's an interesting book, and I guess this is where his apparent love of Borges comes in as well. This idea of sort of maps and territories, like that really, really famous Borges short story about that map that so perfectly illustrated the territory that it was representing, that they started to feed into each other. That idea of explanatory models and living in the world as just directly experiencing it versus having these explanatory models of the world standing between you and experience at all times.
Right.
And that over-explanation of the world can really, really impact your ability to feel the magic of being alive. And the book does seem to grasp in that direction, but it's not in a lecturing way. You get a feeling for it, because this book is very oblique in most things it says, or basically everything it says.
Right. And I mean, honestly, that's I love that short story by Borges. And then of course you have Welbeck's best novel, The Map in the Territory. Or did I say it right? I think I messed it up. Which I think is his best novel. That one and The Possibility of an Island, which are also, in a way, I forgot to mention Welbeck. Solenoid does have a little bit of Welbeckian feel to it. It's not as pervy in French as
no, it's way less. It's just way more Eastern.
Yeah, it's way more Eastern European.
Much more Eastern.
But Welbeck does mess with these kind of absurdist, like bleak kind of themes also, with robots and weird stuff where you're like, okay, you think you're reading with the Possibility of an Island, for example, you think you're going to read a book about an old dude that's like trying to sleep with 20-year-olds, and then it turns into this post-apocalyptic, metaphysical, like meditation on self and purpose in life. And there's superhuman robots and, I don't know, dogs that are cloned every week and stuff like that. And, just insane stuff like that. And you get that, but you're right. Like when you explain something, when you put down something in, concrete, like, dogmatic idea, right? You're not living the real world either, right? You're living the explanation. You start fitting your observations to the explanations, and you can't control that, right? You, in a way, when you have a map, you start following the map. What I think a good kind of way to visualize this idea is that, do you remember when we were young, and you're probably old enough to remember this, right? When we had to memorize where shit was, right?
Yeah.
We had to experience our cities, driving through our cities, completely blind, right? And we used to be able to be like, oh, I turned left at this blue dumpster, and then right at the weird tree, and I park right after the homeless guy, like that type of thing. That's how I experienced where I grew up, right? But now we don't even see the world, because most people just turn on their phone, put it on their dashboard, Google Maps it, or Apple Map it, or whatever, and we experience the map more than we experience the environment around us. So we are completely in a different dimension, right? In a way, right? We're experiencing the flat dimension of Google Maps instead of the actual input from the real world, right? And I think when you become dogmatic in your explanations of phenomena in the world, you start doing that, basically, in a way. And you need to kind of break through that, because it's not how the universe works, and I think we become diminished by doing that, just get lost.
Yeah, the map, the Google Maps example is a really good one, because it also shows that these representations often exist for a reason. Like the Google Maps representations are really useful. We can use it to do things that we actually want to do, like navigate space accurately. But at the same time, it's like, it sounds trivially true to say, but it really goes for all of our explanatory models. It's not real in the sense that it doesn't have some perfect correspondence to reality. It just reflects a few salient aspects of it that we think are useful. And you get into trouble when you start to not be able to acknowledge that you are actually operating within some sort of model. Whether we can ever really escape them, I'm actually not sure. They seem so incredibly ubiquitous. Probably not, because I suspect that those models also help us assign salience to sensory data. Otherwise, it would just be pure chaos.
Right. It would be like what the character in Solenoid saw when he looked through that hole.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so
Right.
he's got his boat-shaped house with a giant tower coming out of it, and he climbs up the outside of the tower. The first time, actually, he goes into it, closes the door, and says that the darkness is so profound that he just loses even this like propriosensitive idea of his body as an object in space, and then just forgets himself until he finds the light switch and turns it on.
Right, which is an echo to Murakami's. Come on, I'm reading it right now. What's it called? Wind Up Bird, right? Where
I do really
climbs
need
down
to
into a
read
well.
something by him.
So in that book, the main character, he climbs down into this well, and it's the same thing, this profound darkness, and he basically disassociates in this darkness of the well, and he's able to kind of like travel in the mind somewhere else because of this darkness disassociation, which is very similar to what happens in Solenoid.
Yeah, and then from that, because I'll describe in vague terms what happens in this, because then it's a good way to jump on to show listeners how the plot, in inverted commas, plot functions. But once he's got the light back on, he descends the interior of the tower, finds a dentist's chair that reminds him of his childhood, finds a porthole that at one point he looks through and sees this world of, it turns out they're scabies-mites, like marching along under a different sun. And then he notices that beneath the dentist's chair are all of these like vessels, like organic vessels that drink the pain of anyone sitting in the chair. And I walk through these things to point out each of these different things, like the scabies thing, points to a different part of the book where his consciousness is beamed into the body of the perfect scabies-mite living on a librarian's hand, and he lives out his life among the mites to tell them that they're actually living on the body of a much larger organism. And he sees a glimpse of it through a porthole. Then the dentist chair refers to this clinic. I think it's called like the Machina de Pain, which is some clinic he was taken to as a child. Then also the veins that drink the misery it's referred to at the end of the book, and then through the book when he keeps waking up at night because these creatures from beneath Bucharest, which feed on his suffering, just will like throw him across the room when he's dreaming. My point being that in just this one scene of him walking to a different part of his house, the story is splitting off and referring to all sorts of other bits of the story. And you can read the story in a one-dimensional way along the text, like the way the text is set out on the page. Or you would, I imagine, actually make it through the entire book if you just follow the symbols. So, for example, you read him descending the interior of his house's tower, and then when he looks out the window and sees, it's this world of gigantic mites, if you then skip to the bit where he is himself a mite and then he wakes up, and you just keep following the book in that way, you would also make it through the book just in a totally different shape.
Right.
The entire book is structured like this. Everything is interconnected. It's why I say it feels high-dimensional. You can navigate it through so many different paths. And because it's effectively plotless, it would make the same amount of sense.
Right. But there is a plot there. He's a failed teacher. He buys a house. He decides to become a teacher. He buys a crappy house real cheap from a weird dude that disappeared or something like that, right? And then he goes to school he teaches school, and then he has an affair with Irina, right? Yeah. And then they do what they do at the end. Right.
Yeah, I actually don't want to spoil the ending. Thanks for not spoiling it. Because unlike, say, Pynchon, there's actually a plot payoff. So I'm a pinch and enjoyer. You know, I'm fine with Tyrone Slothrop's character arc ending with him just kind of dissolving into post-World War II Germany. But it was a real surprise getting to the end of this book and thinking, oh, there was actually plot payoff and emotional payoff. The ending of the book was surprisingly emotional.
Right. No, I agree. I think the ending is my favorite part because the ending, like, okay, for listeners, one of the problems with a lot of these maximalist novels is that they tend to dissolve into nothing, or there's what's the point? The trip is the point, right? Which is Pynchon is very guilty of it. Even in in his most thorough short novel, Inherent Vice, which I love, by the way, if you've never read Inherent Vice, it's a detective story that does end and it has resolution. It's still kind of like, and I think that, in Solenoid, there's a select ending. There's a very select ending, and he makes a point. Like he does in a way the author, and then the author narrator and the characters basically look at the world he just presented, and he makes a value judgment.
Yeah, and that was surprising actually, because up to this point everything was much more oblique, whereas at the end, he does really seem to take a stand on something.
Right. I mean, and then when you read the ending, you see it coming. He doesn't telegraph it, but he does well. He builds up to it well. You're like, oh yeah, duh. That's the point. Like that's the point of all this. So it really does have a satisfying ending, an insane ending, which is awesome. To take it back to like a religious aspect, right? And the novel's not a very overtly religious novel. It's more of a conceptually metaphysical novel in a way. He lives on the street called Mica Domnului. I don't know if you read that. What that translates to, the novel doesn't translate it, right? It doesn't translate in English, but it means it's basically the Virgin Mary, right? The Mother of God is what it translates to. So he lives in a boathouse, right? On the street called the Mother of God, right? And then there's Irina, and then they end the novel at that chapel.
Yeah.
Right. So and then the boathouse is the key to his solenoid thing, right? It's where the fucking pain thing is, and the dental chair in the tower, right? Now, I think one interesting way to look at the whole mite thing, the whole, scaby thing or whatever, right?
It's so just for, like, I want to reinforce to listeners, there is an extended section of this novel where the main character is a scabies-mite and living in scabies-mite land.
On his own skin. Probably.
No, he's on the skin of... There's a librarian from his youth who has stopped being a librarian and has a copy of the Voynich... a copy of the Voynich manuscript that he was waiting to give to the main character, having set him on a trajectory to meet him in the future by placing select books in the library where he knew he would look. I think. Right. So the way I interpreted it is, I mean, you can interpret it a million ways, right? But one way is that the mite thing is the scaby thing, right? Is he's trying to illustrate the dimensions, right, of perspective, right? And to take it back to the metaphysical and the religious, right? If you think about Christianity, God comes down to earth as a human, right? He becomes God, incarnated in the figure of Jesus Christ, right? Now you have a being as all-powerful, all-knowing as God that is outside time and space, right? And then he becomes a scabie, basically, right? So to us, to the scabie is a huge perspectual like loss, right? Imagine a being as all-powerful as God to a human, right? So now that uses it to illustrate, I think it uses it to illustrate that very well, right? How
we are but a scabies, you know what I mean, to the higher beings in the world.
So that connection's really interesting because that reminds me of, so towards the end of the novel, he gets Irina pregnant. So this woman who's also a teacher at School 86. And so throughout the book, so there's a solenoid beneath his bed in his boathouse that makes him levitate above it when you turn it on. And they've been having sex levitating above the bed. But I'm pretty sure it's one of the few times they have sex not in the air, but on the bed itself, on the ground, that she gets pregnant. And so that idea of descent to something more mundane feels significant within the context of what you just said.
Right. There's a lot of like symbolism in that, right? What about his ex-wife?
That was a really weird story. That felt more like a Pynchon story. Contact has been made.
Right. There's a huge subplot, which I still haven't figured out exactly.
I don't know what to make of. I think is it pronounced Stefana?
Yeah, Stefana.
Mm-hmm.
Stefana. Which is interesting because in the subplot, he at one point the main character reveals that. So okay, just conceptually, we're reading his diary. Right? It hops back and forth. He reveals that he's had an ex-wife, right? And
it's just like it's so offhand as well. Like there'll be just a sentence on it, and then he won't mention it for 200 pages.
Right. Well, it's because it was an obviously traumatic experience for the character, and he finally goes into the explanation about his ex-wife, and I believe that was she a nurse or something like that? I
forget what she was.
He met her somewhere, and they had a great relationship. It was very idyllic at first, and then she goes insane, right? And she either has some sort of schizophrenia or some sort of, borderline personality disorder, something like that, where she becomes less and less like human, and she basically becomes a doppelganger. Where he describes her as kind of like a doppelganger, where she is no longer the same person anymore. Mm-hmm. And he honestly believes that, or the way he interprets it is that she's no longer she's a alien,
Yeah.
And
he just says she's not her. And because of the way this book treats reality, so things like finding a gigantic skull beneath Bucharest is just it's just there. And it's not disputed. Because there's that constant seeming dream logic at work everywhere, it's actually really unclear if she does have some sort of psychotic disorder, or equally, she might just be a different person. And in the context of this book, you don't know. You have no way of establishing that.
Right. And we're talking about dream logic in a lot of places because, one, there's a huge subsection of the book about dreams specifically in Paris, and the idea of, I can't even pronounce it, oniomancers or oneriomancers.
Yeah.
And which is like the ability to affect dreams and the ability to travel into dreams and experience vivid dreams. And there's characters that dream on purpose, and they study this, which, once again, it's based on a real person around the turn of the century, a pre-Jungian guy that went to go study with a very pre-Jungian. I forgot what his name is. He was a French...
Nicolas Vaschidor.
And then he studied with a French guy at the École des Sciences in Paris, who was actually, I was looking it up before we started, and he was one of the guys that developed the French guy that the character studied with, was one of the guys that developed the first IQ test, interestingly enough, which is interesting. And the idea, anyway, so it goes into the ideas of dreams of is this real, is it not? And of course, we're dealing with a first person diary that we're reading. So is he just insane? I mean, can you read the whole novel as his cope for dealing with being a dude in a, Soviet era, communist country, where his opportunities in life just led him to be a crappy high school teacher, and he's just basically coping, and then you get to the end. You can really read the book like that, right? But that's not a fun way to look at it, right? You know what I mean, right? Which once again is like, how do we look at our own lives, right? We can take the lives of some of the greatest people ever and just cope it into boringness, right? And just go, he did this, and that, and then for like 6 months he fought a Revolutionary War, but then, he was a farmer for 20 years afterwards, and he died of like butt cancer or something, So yeah, I mean, we can completely like subvert or like bring everything down at that level. But yeah, I mean, this is a novel that I think you got to read it. We can talk about this forever, and people are gonna be like, you just guys are insane, It's one that when I read it, so I was born in Bucharest, right? I was born in the city that this novel takes place in. And just due to circumstances, I wrote a post about it if anybody's interested. I just never made it back home, mostly because financial reasons. And then, I didn't have money. And then when I did have money, I didn't have time or whatever. While I was reading this novel, I was like, God, the city is such a big part of it. And it's such an interesting, like, kind of like weird, nightmarish, neo-Gothic kind of vibe to it in the novel. I was like, I have to go. I need to save up money. And my wife's like, why don't you just go, dude? Just, I don't know, buy a ticket. They're not that expensive. And I was like, but no, I need to save money and get hotel. He's like, why don't you just go? And I was like, oh yeah, I should probably just go. So I bought a ticket and I flew out like a few weeks later, and I walked around a lot of the places in the book and mostly the central area and stuff. And that's what it inspired me. And the book inspired me to go see these places in the novel. I didn't find the cool morgue thing with the, the dental chair and the creatures that suck your soul, but it's interesting because that's really what a good book does. A good book makes you just talk about things forever. And like, just even our conversation right now, I'm having a bunch of ideas about like what it means, one thing, and I want to ask your opinion on this, right? Because you're a writer and you're a novelist yourself, right? We are I think we're in a precarious time for the novel, right? Like we have to face the reality that the main art form in our world right now is movies, right? And then even movies are getting replaced by, internet media garbage and video games and that type of stuff. So what do we do for the novel? And in my opinion, the novel is still the greatest art form ever when it comes to this level of conversation. And I think as writers, and I said this when I talked to everybody, I constantly bring this up, right? Is I think that a novel, when you're writing a novel, you have to write to the strengths of the novel, right? You have to be able to take the elements of the written word and the form of the novel that a movie cannot do, right? Solenoid is unfilmable, right?
Yeah, it would just be pure chaos.
There's no way you can make Solenoid into a movie. You can't. It's not even one of those like, oh well, it'll probably be a good TV show. No. Like the only person that could even come close to getting like 1/100th of it is like maybe David Lynch, in like some Twin Peaks Mulholland Drive kind of like thing. But even then, never. You're never going to have a Solenoid movie, and if you do, whoever makes it is retarded. It would never work. In the same way with a lot of like Pynchon novels, except for Inherent Vice, it just would not make sense as movies at all. It'd be horrible, because what the novel can do is exactly what Solenoid does. It allows you to tesseract, to experience multiple times at the same time, multiple variations, multiple things. And that's where the strength of the novel is. And no other medium has been able to really do that. Take a 2D representation and make you use your brain, right? Which you could say it's your solenoid in a way, right? Because that's what is the key to conceptualize these concepts. The music can do that somewhat emotionally with like, tonals, tonal variations and that type of stuff. But film cannot do that. All right. Film cannot do that. Film cannot do any of that. Video games can't do that. None of this stuff can do that. So the novel itself is an artifact and an object, but it also one that makes you conceptualize things like, being a scaby.
Yeah.
Right? And the different layers. And I think when you're an author, when you're writing, you need to look at yourself, right? And people go, "Oh, I want to sell my novel to Hollywood." Well, why? Why would you want to do that? I mean, yeah, okay, you want some money,
You make
right?
a ton of money, but
Yeah, I'm not going to give you that. I admit it, right? But my opinion, and people will say, "Oh, you're a snob." Look at me, I'm not a snob, man. I don't even shave anymore. Like, in my opinion, if your novel can be filmed, it's not a great novel, right? Because it did not take advantage of the strength of this, right? If your novel can be filmed, if you wrote a novel or a written work that can be made into a movie, and that's your intention, then just write a fucking movie, right? You know what I mean? Go make a movie. Go get some camera equipment, get some friends, and make a movie, right? Why would you do that? Why would you? I'm not gonna write a piano concerto with the goal of a rock band doing a cover, right? But tons of novelists do that. They're like, "Oh yeah, I write books because I eventually want to sell them." And why would you do that? You're debasing the art form in a way. That's just my opinion.
yeah, there's a ton there. One thing that I think novels are my favorite art form. It's
Right.
it's something I always return to. One thing that I think they do that's very special, that's very hard to replicate is, so it's where are they quite explicit and quite inexplicit. So in something like a movie, in terms of the visuals, they're extremely explicit, like, because they are just depicting moving images on a screen. Novels can be really, really, really explicit about internal states, like Solenoid. You're in this guy's head for 600 pages. But in terms of the images and what is depicted, they're very inexplicit because you, as the reader, have to imagine what's going on. The author tells you some things about what is appearing, but ultimately you have to construct it in your head. And I find that intersection really, really fascinating and really special. And I feel like it allows the reader to inject so much of themselves into constructing these images from basically an instruction manual in text to create something of their own in their head with enough emotional or character guide rails from the author. In terms of what I'm doing about the novel just being a less culturally relevant art form today is just not much. I just write what I want to write. I don't really think about that. I don't think I'm going to save the novel by setting out to intentionally write a novel-saving novel.
Right, you can. You got to do what the character does at the end, right?
Yeah.
Right, it's gonna.
Yeah, I would really like to write an unfilmable novel. At the moment, it's just technical ability. Like I'm not a good enough writer in terms of the technique of it to write something like Solenoid. I hope one day, if I write for a few decades, I'll hit that point where I write something that can only be conveyed in text. That'd be really special.
I think that a lot of it is just inspiration and luck. It's like being at the right place, finding that node, like that, and then like taking advantage of it if you find it, because you got people that have decades of experience and have never written anything good, so it's one of those things where there's a mystical quality to it. No matter what the hard work people believe, it's just you can work hard at studying and writing. And some of the best technical writers I know write absolute garbage when it comes to actual like meaningful stuff, even though they've studied for 20 years, or over than that.
I'm trying to think of what you were saying about this being an unfilmable novel, and I think it is, but I feel like if you took an indirect approach to it, you could not mirror what is happening in the novel, or have a film adaptation, but you could almost, as a symbol, point in the same direction by having a surreal piece of film, a film that really relied on a succession of repeating linked symbols, like a really bizarre piece of cinema, like something that would make absolutely no money at the box office. But I reckon you could probably make something that points in the same direction by using the strengths of film and really relying on that. Because I totally agree with you. Just trying to recreate Solenoid on film is a waste of time. Like, it's just not happening.
I mean, in the same genre, I think as Solenoid would be, David Lynch's work, something like Mulholland Drive.
Yeah, I think they point in a similar direction.
Right, and have you seen Mulholland Drive?
No, I watch very few films.
Okay, and there's certain movies, and this is what we're going to do on the podcast, okay, on the Black Ibis Social Club. We're going to start watching a lot more movies because movies are easy to watch and talk about compared to novels, because it takes you, 3 weeks to read Solenoid, but it takes you 2 hours to watch Mulholland Drive, and we can kind of work those in together. David Lynch is an American director. For people that are not familiar with, you should be familiar with them. And he's probably my favorite, director and my favorite, film writer. And he's originally known for the TV show Twin Peaks. And Twin Peaks is it's a movie that it's a long show, 3 seasons, that is disguised as a domestic cop investigation from 1990 or 1990. But then it goes into dream logic. There's a alternate dimension called the Black Lodge. There's talking owls, people that talk backwards, a talking tree, midgets. It's just insane shit. David Bowie appears out of nowhere, like the real David Bowie. Chris Isaak, the musician. And it's one of the greatest television shows of all time. And all his movies follow dream logic. Mulholland Drive specifically is about Los Angeles and like the movie industry. And it's about it's very similar to Solenoid in a way, where it's a movie where, and I recommend you watch it and take the time to watch it because it's a 2-hour movie. It's about a young woman that goes to Hollywood to become an actress, but then she splits. And the movie actually, no spoiler because it doesn't really matter, half the movie's dream logic and half the movie's reality. And you have a hard time, and they're played by 2 different people, but they're the same person. It's very similar to the situation where, like, in one reality, the actress was she became like everybody was nice to her and blah, blah, blah. And she like succeeded in Hollywood. And in the other one, she basically ended up like a prostitute that got murdered. And the movie takes place in that middle where there's this interaction, and it kind of like swoops between the two. And it just like in Solenoid and just like in some of the best novels and stuff, there's no explanation, right? There's clues, but it doesn't tell you like when's where or what's about, or, and you're done with the movie. You're like, I'm not really sure what the hell I just watched. But then you think about it again, you're like, oh, I see. There's multiple narratives that if you look for the signs, just like how you said, where you can follow the scabie, right? There's a linear line. Same thing in the movie, but in this movie, it's there's symbols like light switches being turned on, repeating motifs that like indicate like a jump between reality and dream, or this dream and this dream. There's ceiling fans spinning, so you're dealing with like dream logic, which is very interesting. And I'm fascinated by that. I mean, I'm fascinated by the idea of dreams, and I'm fascinated by the idea of, where do ideas come from? You know, when does, like, you know, when you write and you're just in this space, like, how does your brain work? You know what I mean? And even if you say, oh, it's like, you know, your chemicals, we all know the biological like explanation for why our like frontal lobe does whatever, but why, you know, and where, you know, and I don't know, like, I'm just fascinated by that kind of stuff. And that's where the novel excels at, I think, you know, in that area. Do you know what's the one thing the film does way better than novels? Car chases.
Yeah. Action scenes are...
Right. You can't have a good car chase in a novel. Yeah. Like, the film is like made for the car chase. It's the peak, or like a plane chase.
There's a visceral aspect of film. A film and music that you don't get so much with a novel. I guess with those things, because they're more directly experienced, because you're getting visuals, or with music, you're getting this sound that you directly experience, and it evokes emotions in you when you hear it, sort of whether you want to or not. Whereas with a novel, when you stop reading it, it doesn't keep going. Like, you're the one who has to make it go. You're having to put in this mental effort and construct it yourself. Right.
Because the film is right here, you know, you're looking through a window, and then a novel's like in here, you know, it's like inside the head, right? I mean, I think what's important, though, is to note that I do not in any way look down upon film. I think that film, the medium of, you know, movies and entertainment, it's a fantastic. It's the most critical art of the 20th century, of the later 20th century, and it's like peak American art in a way, even though sometimes the French and stuff do it better too, but in Italians. But it's a different art form, all right?
Yeah.
Even though they both tell a story, what is valued in film is the visual and the spectacle in a way, and capturing an image. I mean, Tarkovsky, what does Tarkovsky say? He says that like film is sculpting in time, right? Which is, I think it's a good way to explain, right? He says you're creating a film is a sculpture in time. So we're going back to the whole dimensions tesseract thing, right?
Yeah.
That is a good
dimensional artifact.
Right. That is a good way to think about a movie as a sculpture in time, of light. You're sculpting light in time, right? But it's a completely different medium, and what works in film does not work in the novel, and vice versa. There's some interaction, like all medium does, but oftentimes you have people go, oh yeah, you know, is the book better than the movie? And you have that kind of stuff. They never tend to work that well. Even great adaptations, like people love Lord of the Rings, right? I mean, it's all right, you know? But the more accurate to the novel, the less of a good movie it is, in a way, you know? And a lot of times you have an example of like, well, the movie based on this book is awesome. Like The Shining, like Stephen King's Shining done as Kubrick's Shining. The movie is superior to the novel because it completely ignored the fucking novel.
Yeah.
Right? Like, he threw away like 90% of the stuff about that novel that was annoying as shit, right? And like cheesy. And he made a much better movie just using the inspirations. And movies from novels work when the director, who's the artist of the actual filmmaking process, identifies the key elements and then ignores the rest of the stuff, you know?
American Psycho is a good example of that, where like in the film, I forget the name of the director, but she got rid of so much of the book and basically just focused on Patrick Bateman being a completely ridiculous character.
Right.
Like,
I actually like the book better.
I think they're
Have you read the book?
Yeah. The book is quite different from the film because the book is so weird. Like, it's a very odd novel. It's quite exhausting, actually, because you're constantly hit over the head by descriptions of just his ridiculous clothes
and murder
and murder. Yeah.
Right. Actually, that's a great example of what we're talking about, though, right? Where the book, American Psycho, I'm a pretty big fan of Bret Easton Ellis, who wrote that book. It's written from the first person in its internal monologue of Patrick Bateman, the main character, right? So it's very similar to Solenoid or a lot of the maximalist novels where it's internal monologue and internal emotions or lack of emotions, right? And there's a lot of, I would say, like not jumping perspective, but Bret Easton Ellis is doing some postmodern stuff here. He's trying to comment on that culture of 80s New York City and the kind of like the market of like Wall Street dudes and that type of thing. And their like callousness and their just lack of being, you know, like these people aren't a person. And one thing that, in a way, I forget the director's name also, but she did a really good job of taking a very difficult book, surprisingly, based on the theme, but it's very difficult in a way because it's very internal, and she did make it, you know, she did an external like version of it. And I really think what's his name who played Patrick Bateman really made the movie. Right?
Christian Bale
like really made the movie, right? And they're remaking it. I don't know if you know this, they're remaking it, right? And it's going to be trash 100%. Because he's not Christian Bale. And it's like the director doesn't understand that movie was good due to luck, not because of anything that they did or because of the book itself. Because one of the things that the movie misses compared to the book is this element. I mean, the movie tried, right? If you remember in the book, Patrick Bateman and all the other dudes are interchangeable.
Yeah, and like he'll just flat out forget who he's talking to. They're constantly calling each other by the wrong names or by different names in the same conversation.
And this is a guy that sits there and catalogs songs, products he puts on his skin, products he eat, you know, every food he eats, like, you know, gives like ratings, like catalogs all this stuff, but cannot remember what his coworkers look like or his girlfriends, right? It's a level of, you know, inhumanity that like goes beyond the visual. And the film format cannot really elaborate that because actors look different, right? Us as the viewer will know it's this guy instead of this guy, you know? I guess you can find a quirky, fun way to do it, but then you get into bizarro land, right? But in the novel, every character he interacts with, for the most part, is faceless. Has no description for him. He never describes what the dude looks like.
It's only their clothes.
Only their clothes.
Ellis does this really brilliant piece of characterization, which I thought was just like funnier than life itself, where Bateman, for those who haven't read it, I expect a lot of people listening have read the book, but you're locked in Bateman's head and his point of view the entire time. And just whenever he looks at anyone, he's going to tell you everything they're wearing, like the brand, the make, how much it costs, everything like that. And after a while, you kind of, as the reader, just start screening that, or you'll read it, but it doesn't quite register as unusual. But then there's this moment where he says, like, I'm actually not quite sure who made this jacket. And in doing that, Ellis has just like twigged you to, oh, it's not the author saying these things. Patrick Bateman just has in his head a catalogue of all of these different clothes that he's just able to rattle off at will.
Right.
Which is like that. It's just a crazy piece of characterization that's very hard to do in a film. I think also people reading novels have a higher tolerance for things being monotonous. And I don't say monotonous in a pejorative way, but monotonous just in the sense of like repetitive and slightly boring, which the lists of all these characters' clothes in American Psycho is very monotonous. But it actually serves a real artistic purpose. And I feel like in a lot of films, there's just a bit less tolerance for that level of monotony.
Well, the idea of the list is a very, very powerful literary device, right? And Mr. Neil from Pylon Press, in all his one-on-ones in our little chats we've done, he always stresses the idea of the power of the list. And once you realize that lists are powerful, you look at novels and you see lists all the time, and you're like, oh, they're listing things, right? Sometimes in threes, it's always a good thing. They're bam, 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 right? And a good example of a list as taken as an entire format is in Bolaño's 2666. Its powerful chapter is a list of murders.
Oh, that was brutal. That was exhausting.
I mean, that's a list, right? He's fucking listing all these murders in the same way Patrick Bateman lists clothes, right? Completely unemotional. And you look at Patrick Bateman and you've got that idea of like, you know, how we were talking earlier about making a map, right? Solidifying, right? Patrick Bateman lacks any internal emotions. He has become a character. He's become a man that doesn't exist, right? He does not exist. He does not have, in the same way that the character in Solenoid has an internal, like his collection of like his childhood, his TB, you know, his love and stuff. Patrick Bateman lacks that completely. He is held together by routine and lists in a way, right? That's all he is. He is a collection of songs, a collection of, you know, I mean, and is that what we are in a way? Like, do we kind of become that as people? You know, we've all met those guys that are just a collection of like sports ball teams and things we do on the weekend, and that's it, you know, or are, you know, accomplishments based on the pathway. Like, I went to college, I got my degree, I got this job, and then I'm a paycheck, right? And then everybody I interact with is he's a blah, blah, blah grad who works for these guys, and he likes, you know, Pumas and Ralph Lauren glasses or something like that. And his favorite sports ball team is like the Vikings. You know, do we do that for people? Do we look at the world in these kind of external like lists? I don't know. It's interesting because American Psycho, and I never thought about that until just now, which is what's great about having these kind of conversations. It's also just like Solenoid about leaving the dimension, right? Because his obsession here is that this is not an exit, right? You know?
Yeah.
And just like Solenoid, you can look at it as everything's normal, and then something abnormal happens, and then it's normal, and something abnormal happens, you know, like I'm going to kill a homeless guy, you know? And the way it's described, when you watch the movie, which I recommend people read the book instead of watch the movie, do both. When you watch the movie, you have a character arc of Patrick Bateman killing people. You're like, he's going to get caught or not? That's kind of the arc you're looking for.
Yeah.
In the book, that's not what's interesting. It's the murders themselves are as uninteresting as his, you know, Eagles reviews or whatever, right?
Yeah, and that's the really cool bit, how the same more emotional salience is attached to descriptions of people's clothes, and then just really long reviews of fairly bland pop songs. And like that'll be placed right next to this scene of mind-bending violence that he relays to you in the same way as, yeah, these are the shoes someone was wearing.
Right. He's like, oh, I just killed this bum real quick, got on the way to the ATM, and then I walked down the street and I stabbed this kid at the zoo, you know? Anyways, but his mom was wearing a fantastic like polo, you know, shirt and blah, blah. And it's like, I think that's the inhumanity of the character or the world he's trying to portray. Like that whole thing where he talks to the ATM and he's like, oh, the ATM's talking to me, but he just you know, he just says like nonchalant, like it's no big deal. Just like the skull in Bucharest, right? I always thought there's an interesting thing, right? Which when it comes to American fiction, I think that there's a trilogy of novels that people should read that are connected. And they're the 1990s Generation X disassociation novels, right? And I don't know if you're familiar with this, right? And I connect them, in my mind, they're part of the same genre and the same, like, they're like a trilogy, right? And one of them is American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis, right? Fight Club by Chuck Palahniuk, and then Up in the Air by Walter Kieran. I don't know if you've read that. All three of them have movies. All three of them are pretty popular, and they have movies, right? And they have pretty famous movies, with obviously Fight Club being the most popular. They are the same novel, completely different, like in theme, right? But they're all about a male, usually a Gen Xer, that has a very disassociative experience and a reaction to our American way of life. And they're class-based. American Psycho is your upper class, like striver class, right? You got your guys, you know, he's a wealthy guy. And Patrick Bateman, you know, it's revealed that like he's a Nepo baby, you know, you find out like in that novel. And also like Bret Easton Ellis brings him up later in different novels, where you find out that like he does nothing at work because he's a Nepo baby, you know? He has no meaning in his life.
Isn't it everyone in his workplace was an associate manager as well?
Right, exactly.
Like, actually, just every person is an associate manager.
Well, they do nothing, right? Which is what, you know, investment bankers do, is nothing. They shuffle numbers around, right? They don't create product, therefore they have no meaning. The next novel is the lower class novel, which is Fight Club. Fight Club is a working class dissociation problem. It's the working class man not having the outlet, right? And Fight Club happens, right? The third novel is like the middle class novel, Up in the Air, which I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's a great novel if you haven't read it. And it's about a guy that spends his entire life traveling on airplanes. And he's obsessed with having the highest air miles ever, right? For this airline that he travels across the country. He's like a salesman, but he kind of stops being a salesman because he gets fired, but he refuses to accept being fired. And you find out like he's as disconnected from the real world as Patrick Bateman or, you know, the narrator of Fight Club is, because he's just traveling. He lives in airports. And it's a great novel because it's, out of the three of them, it's the most middle class of them, because the character is a squarely Midwestern middle class dude, unlike the big city guys from the other two. And together they're a trilogy of the problem with modern life, in a way where there's no meaning, right? There's a lack of meaning in the things we do, where we just follow that map, but the map has no meaning in a way, and there's no meaning behind the map. And they're a very American concept that's very alien, I think, to Eastern Europeans, because there's a struggle, not struggle, that Americans have that Eastern Europeans don't, because they accept the misery. You know what I mean? Like, Americans need a purpose. You know, other guys are like, oh, life sucks. But yeah, I recommend those three novels to be read as a whole, in a way.
It's an interesting thing with at least with American Psycho, because I haven't read the other two novels. It, again, is the real advantage of novels versus other art forms, in that in American Psycho, Patrick Bateman's internal state is rendered in a great amount of detail, but Bret Easton Ellis can control what you, as the reader, see of everything around him, in that he can, because of the medium, get away with not describing people's faces. You just don't know what they look like, but you know what clothes they have. Right. Whereas in a film, for example, like you need to show those things. Or if you didn't, like if you just had clothes, you know, black void where someone's face was, you're still depicting something quite explicitly. Like you're still making, that would be such a heavy-handed statement. You're, right, because of the pictorial nature, really cornered into depicting something there. Whereas in a novel, you can actually just not mention it. And it's not there. It's just left up to the reader.
Interestingly enough, there's a bit of a shitlord joke in American Psycho, is that if you look at all the clothes he describes and put them together, they would look retarded.
Yeah, they're ridiculous. Yeah.
Right. And that's done on purpose, which the movie couldn't do. The movie had to have like subdued and like not follow the right. Otherwise, it would completely, you know, it look ridiculous, you know, and it would stand out. But that was part of the inside joke that Bret Easton Ellis put. Which you got to think, it's quite the achievement when the dude was like 22 when he wrote that novel.
Yeah, and I think less than zero. I forget how old.
He was like, he wrote Less Than Zero in high school.
Yeah, that's ridiculous. Yeah, and then American Psycho, I think, was published in his mid-20s. It's just stupid.
Right. So you're like, yeah, cool, man. You know, it was a different time now. You know, it was different. Man, you know, when the guy was rich, he'll admit it. He was you know, he's a rich kid, and he went to a rich kid art school, like, you know, literature school on the East Coast, and you know, he got to hang out with like Donna Tartt, who also published her first novel very young, right after college. The Secret History, which was another great novel. But, you know, so it doesn't really matter. Like, you just do it, man, right? Like, you just put it out, have something to say. And his latest novel is actually pretty good if you ever get a chance to read it, called The Shards. It's actually one of his better ones, actually. It's up there with American Psycho as him. But what else? What do you want to talk about?
I was wanting to ask a bit more about Bucharest and your experience there, because you don't have to dox, but you were a kid when you left Bucharest,
right? So I mean, I did. If you listen to our podcast, I talk about it a bunch, and I think I talked a lot about it on what's his name's podcast just recently. I was born in 1983, so there you go. I'm 41 years old.
So you didn't see too much of Ceausescu.
No, and I grew up in I would say, what would be the equivalent of a communist era middle class. I think in communism you had like three classes of people. You had like the party people that were in charge of stuff, and then you had everybody else, like your proletariat, who faced the brunt of the ills of communism. My dogs are barking, sorry. And then you had
every podcast episode with you.
I know, I just have these fucking dogs, man. They're always like, they should be characters on your podcast. It's like, and then you had the technical class, right? You know, teachers and engineers and that kind of stuff that lived the best way they could. You know, and that's kind of where was my parents' parents were engineers, and then teachers on one side, engineers on the other. So, I mean, I don't have any bad memories of growing up in like communism. Of course, communism collapsed when I was 6 years old in '89, and I remember that. But I have a childhood memory of living there, right? And as a kid, you make the best of everything. You know, I remember parks and hanging out with my family and playing with my little brother. You know, I don't have like these like atrocious, miserable life stories that a lot of people living in communism do, because my parents worked really hard to shelter me from that. I didn't drink a Coca-Cola until I was 6, right?
It's probably not a bad thing, actually.
Right, you know, and I didn't grow up having television, because there was one channel and it was black and white, and it was basically about a Mao Zedong's tractor or something like that, you know. And I don't, you know, I remember the city not having a lot of cars in it, because only rich people or party people had like cars. But I don't, you know, and I don't have these horrendous like oppression stories, you know, and, you know, none of my family was murdered, or I mean, one, but I don't want to get into that. But like a lot of these kind of stuff is like, it didn't really affect me, right? I mean, it did, because it affected who I am, but I don't have your typical immigrant story of running away. And then we moved to California right after the fall of the whole Berlin Wall and everything. My mom always wanted to move out of. My mom hated Eastern Europe, right? She's a California-phile her entire life. She loved movies and stuff, and she despised everything to do with her home country. She hated communism. She hated religion and tradition. She's almost the ultimate like super lib in a way to describe. I don't know, like okiophobic, to use what's his name's description. And so when she got the chance, she took it, you know. And it wasn't like we had a lot of money with it. It was like a relative thing. We moved to California, and I grew up in California, and I grew up very, very disconnected from Europe. I never my mom, and because of her, my dad basically are like, they were like, yeah, we have nothing to do with Eastern Europe. We're done. We're Americans now, and peace out. You know what I mean? So we never went to like, I don't think I met another Romanian person until like I was in my 20s. Right? She just didn't want anything to do with it. We're like the opposite of most immigrant groups where she's like, we're done. I hate it. We're done. So I grew up a Californian, basically. I grew up lower middle class dude skateboarding in California.
Yeah.
Like nothing special. With these weird, vague memories that were kind of locked away from the time I was born to the time I was, almost 7.
Yeah, because I mean, you've kind of answered this at points, because I was wanting to hear if he gets this sense of Bucharest right, because he seems to both really hate and really love the city in this book. Like, he calls it the saddest city in the world a bunch of times, but then we'll call it the most beautiful city in the world. Like you said earlier, how it just seems to have come into being with all the rust and the decay built into it.
Right. So yeah, he I think he does. I think he does capture it very well. I'm probably not the best. He captures it well from my kind of surface level. Let me tell you a quick story about like the idea of memory and thought and that kind of stuff. And I think I wrote about this. When I was a little kid, my grandpa, who passed away, before we moved to the U.S., on my mom's side, and he was I credit him to a lot of my early development, because he was a heavy reader. He had a huge library of books, and actually, when I went there last time, I went to my other grandma's, and she had a bunch of his books, and I filled my suitcases with books, and I came home with just books. I had to pay all this money to the airline because I brought so many books. But where we lived, there was a park in the center of the city called Cismigiu Park, and I always had this memory of him putting me on top of a statue of Atlas, like Atlas who holds up the globe. And I knew that it was in a rose garden in this park, kind of off the beaten path. And when I say park, I mean like European park, not like American like park, which is like mowed grass and a playground. I'm talking about like the big Central Park type parks. And that memory was like a weird core memory, and one I always go back to, and there's a photo of me on top of that statue with him somewhere in my desk right now. Either way, I haven't been there. I didn't go back for like 30 something years, and I got back into the city, and the first day I was there, I was walking around with my uncle and aunt. And I remembered where everything was from before I was 7, if that makes sense. I could find my way just on memories alone, right? And I told my uncle, I'm like, hey man, there's a statue in the park I want to see, because like it's just a kind of a core memory, And remember, I haven't been there for over 30 years, right? And my uncle's like, he's like, you're stupid. It's not there, He's like, let's go get beers instead. That's what my uncle is. He's just a party dude. And I said, no, I gotta find this. He's like, fine, you can try to find it, but you're not gonna find it because it's probably gone, right? So I went through this maze of this giant park, and I found the fucking statue. I actually remembered how to get to it, right? And it's so insane. And my uncle was like, whoa, I had no idea it was here. And, because it's not like something that's obvious, right? It's like a really obscure off the corner. But I remembered how to get to it 30 something years for it. And it's, it goes back to that map territory thing, right? Where these memories are important, right? They become part of us, and the geography of a city and a place that we're at is very important, That's why often in great literature, cities and places are just as much the main character as the main character, right? The Southwest, for example, of the United States is a big deal, and it's often very critical to the characters. But yeah, it's an interesting story where like how did I remember this? I don't know. I don't know. You know what I mean? I can't tell you how to get to the store here where I live right now. I'm like, I don't know how to get there. But I remembered how to get to a statue on foot across the city, and that's wild to me. And it just shows how our mind works and how our conceptualization of space works,
We tend to close out episodes by saying whether we'd recommend a book or not, to whom and why, which is an interesting question with Solenoid, because I think the book's magnificent, but there probably wouldn't actually be... I'd only recommend it to a fairly particular type of person.
Right.
Because you need to not be too concerned about plot, or you can't need a really gripping plot in your novels, because it's there in a fairly fragmented form, but it's not the point or not the most important bit. That, and it's at times it's just exhausting reading this when you're having to read through so many dream journals, which eventually coalesce into something that feels meaningful, but for quite a while, especially at the beginning, it feels like you're just reading this guy's random dreams for ages and you're not seeing much payoff. So I'd recommend it very, very highly to people who like these sort of maximalist novels, who are very patient and just don't feel much need for plot to pull them through, are happy with really powerful images and almost the geometry of a novel, which at least to me is the most fascinating bit of this work. What about you? You obviously really like it, but
right. I agree with you. I think I will say that if you are a listener of this podcast and my podcast, I think you have the intellectual and spiritual acumen to really enjoy the novel, because you obviously have fucking good taste, right? If you can listen to us rant for 3-4 hours about all kinds of topics, you can read Solenoid. Right?
Yeah.
And I would like to think that the kind of people that enjoy our kind of conversations are at the level where they can read it. If you enjoy a linear plot and, something happens, and here's a point, it's probably not for you. If you enjoy David Lynch, Tarkovsky movies, that kind of stuff, then yes, I highly recommend it. If you like Franz Kafka, for example, or Borges specifically is another good one. Yes, I definitely would recommend it, because it's definitely in conversation with those previous writers. And also the writing is fantastic. And before we go, one thing I need to mention is that this is a book in translation. I think it's by Scott Cotter or something like that. The translator himself is just as much important to this novel as the writer, because so often with novels written in a foreign language, the art of the translator is not as good, or it fails. And in this case, he succeeds. I think it's Sam Cotter, I think his name is. And when you read a lot of classics like Dostoevsky, for example, or Tolstoy, the translators really, really matter.
It changes a lot.
Right. A lot of times, like I remember I started reading Three Musketeers and I read a crappy version. I started reading, I'm like, this sucks. And then I went out and read reviews. I'm like, how is this book great? And then somebody said, don't read that translation. And then I picked up one by Paviar, who also translates a lot of Dostoevsky. And it blew my mind what a different novel it was, because there's language is also different dimensions. It doesn't translate word for word. It's not Google Maps and it's not Google Translation, right? There's nuance and art to it, right? So we need to kind of give some credit to the translator. Also, the translator of Boliano also is a great one. It's a woman, I believe. But yeah, I recommend it to people that love tesseracts.
Yeah. I would say so. I find it's less disorienting than peak Pynchon. So we'll leave Inherent Vice to the side, because he did kind of the most Pynchon thing he could do at the end of his career and just kind of wrote a fairly straightforward detective novel.
Or he's like, let me make the Big Lebowski fan fiction.
Yeah, let me really screw with you by writing something you didn't expect. But it's less confusing or just less disorienting than Pynchon when he was writing Mason and Dixon or something like that.
Which I love, by the way.
That's the opening paragraph of Mason and Dixon is just peak English language prose, right. Throwing snowballs at each other.
Right.
It's a lot weirder than Bolaño, or at least I've only read 2666 by Bolaño. I think The Savage Detectives is stranger structurally, or at least so I've heard.
Yes, it is very stranger, but still it's not surreal in the same way that this one is. Yeah.
This is the book is weirder both in terms of the structure and the symbolism and the visuals than Bolaño. It's less hysterical than David Foster Wallace and less almost self-consciously weird. It's more confidently weird than David Foster Wallace. Trying to situate it between all of these other big maximalist novels. And when comparing it to Gaddis, it again, you just get much more of the surreal imagery.
Right.
Yeah. I also it was a good point you made about the translation. It's a really good one. The language is really, really nice. I don't have much of a feel for how difficult or how different Romanian is for English compared to, I don't know, something like translating Czech or Russian into English, which I have a better feel for how hard that is.
It's probably easier, to be honest. It's probably a little bit easier because it's a Latin language.
It's a cool language because it's a Romance language which kept its noun declensions.
Right.
Which is just kind of weird.
I suck at reading it, though. I do try to read Romanian novels in the original language because I've decided to maybe try my hand at translating stuff myself. Mm-hmm. I'm working on it. It's a project. It's a long-term project because my reading education from in Romanian went up to half of first grade. So that's about as far as I go.
Being a translator is such an underappreciated job because not only do you have to be extremely good at least two languages, but you also need to just be a good stylist by yourself.
Right. You have to master the nuances of both. You not just be able to speak it.
Yeah. Thanks so much for coming on. Thanks for recommending this book because this is the sort of book where I was aware of it, but it's the sort of thing where it probably would have taken me 10 years before I got around to reading it. I'm really pleased that I got to read it. It's an excellent book. Looking forward to reading something shorter, a bit less convoluted to take a breather from this one.
You should try the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle next. No, I'm just joking, dude. That's another long. It's like the same. It's like the same book, basically.
I came from
Japanese
2666 and then went straight onto this one. So I'm looking forward to something.
That's funny because that's exactly how I read it too.
Oh, really?
I read Solenoid, then 2666, and I think my next novel I'm going to read is The By Night in Chile.
Yeah, I'm going to have
tiny.
Yeah, I'm going to have a breather. I'm going to read something really quick.
Some pop fiction, some like Conan the Barbarian, something like that.
I still haven't read any of that. That could actually be pretty fun. Read gore. I want to do a gore book for the podcast this year.
Just the gore, like you just get banned from. Isn't it all like weird? Well, you know what? Like the genre that my wife reads is like fairy pornography. So it's basically, that's what all the Barnes and Noble is now.
Yeah, I guess I forget who wrote Gore, but he made the mistake of apparently just laying out in autistic detail the sexual philosophy and dynamics underpinning the Gore universe, which got him into trouble apparently.
Yeah.
Anyway, anything you want to shill or promote before we finish?
Well, so right now, if you guys are familiar with the podcast, which is the Dicenius Review, we're going to change the name to the Black Ibis Social Club because that's what it's become. I'm going to probably drop an episode today as the day I'm recording this, but probably before you see this episode. And it's going to be kind of explain the name change for season 2. Myself and Fisto Sobani are doing a lot of stuff. I'm also working on a novel that I hope to get complete in this upcoming year. And on Substack, I keep on writing essays. Usually they're more current event type of stuff or commenting on current events. My big kick right now is on the idea of patronage and supporting art, which is, I think, a perennial complaint that people have on the internet is like, why can't we do this and why can't we have this? Well, it's like, you got to pay for it, bro. You know, like shit doesn't come free, you know? And if you want something, you have to either make it or support people making it. It's not going to come for free. And that was one of my topics. And then, you know, that's going to continue. And I'm like, you said there's the insect songs, which is kind of my fiction Substack. I'm going to add a lot more stuff to it. I have a huge folder of short stories and pieces I have, but you could probably agree with me. I just hate everything I write.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
I'm just like, and it's funny is that the stuff that I hate the most, people tend to like. Like I have like a piece that I love and I put it out and like nobody likes it. And then I put out something I'm like, this is trash. And then like it gets like 5-star reviews and people love it. I'm like, oh, and it makes me so mad. I don't know why. And it just, that's why there's not a lot of stuff on there because it gives me anxiety to think about it, you know? But yeah.
You're exposed in a special way, I think, writing fiction versus nonfiction.
Right. That's why it's more sparse than my other Substack. But I think the number one thing I do want to request of listeners and viewers, right, is that we need to just continue this conversation. I think it's so awesome that we've got your podcast and there's so many cool like podcasts and we're all sharing them. We've got like a little community going off the Substack and Twitter kind of crowd. And I think when the YouTube podcast kind of era started, the focus was on politics. But I think now that we're doing a lot more literary culture, film culture, and it's so much more interesting than just bitching about like politics all the time. Talking about solenoids and tesseracts and weird dimensions is a lot more interesting than who you should be voting for and that kind of thing. And I think that we should really support this community. So like I try to be subscribed to all you guys, everybody that creates a podcast or has a good Substack, and I'll throw the $5 or whatever in your direction, and I'll try to watch everything. And I have a long drive, so I watch and listen to everything. But you should do that too, because I think that's the key. The key is that Substack, the internet or shared internet is like one of those nodes in Solenoid, and it brings everybody together, you know? And that's how culture is created. Culture is created through community. And, that's important. And that's why I love going on these podcasts and love having everybody on, you know? So please, you're welcome to join me on our podcast whenever in the next few months, right?
We'll talk about right.
I would love to have you on, and all the guys, you know, the Tukey Mag guys and everybody, you know, all the guys you collaborate with, all your friends. It's great. I mean, it's so wonderful that, you know, I'll sit here and see a podcast episode about like Shag Dick, which is a novel I love, and I like the people. I know them personally, and it's so great that I read it 2 years ago, and you guys are doing reviews on it and people talking about it and that kind of stuff. And that's what it's about, right? That's how culture is made. That's how the change in the scope is. We can't just bitch about, oh God, Star Wars sucks now or whatever, you know. Just let's talk about things. Let's you know, make the best of the internet, I think, you know? So yeah, thank you for having me on.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for coming on. Yeah, I definitely second that with the really cool community of, say, the guys at Tukey's Mag, Art of Darkness, rest in peace, Brad Kelly, welcome Abby Lucas. Brad's new podcast, I forget what it's called. He announced it on your
podcast.
He
did. He needs to hurry up and put it out because I need to listen.
Black Ibis Social Club, of course. Yeah, there are lots of really cool ones. New Right. They haven't published too much recently, but
I know.
Dan Baltic and Matt Pegas are both very funny guys, so I look forward to when they come out with something new.
Right, I want Dan Baltic on our podcast. I need to read his book. It's been sitting on my Kindle forever.
If you haven't read Nutcracker, you're in for a treat.
And it looks like a happy book, like a funny, like more upbeat book in a way.
It's a really good-natured book.
Right. And I'm just a miserable human Eastern European, right? So sometimes I'm like, I don't want anything that makes me feel good. I want to fucking be miserable. Give me 2666 murder chapter. Mm-hmm. So I need to be in the right positive mood, like take some Zoloft or something, and then I will read his.
There are some excruciatingly uncomfortable scenes in it of social humiliation, so you can enjoy that.
Everything I've heard about it from people that have read it. It's been so positive, and he's hilarious online on podcasts and on Twitter and stuff. So it's going to be good. All right, man. Thanks for having me on, dude.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on. And for listeners, we'll see you next time.